Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I'm going to tell you about three popular myths that are harmful to international politics. So these are three different myths that, in a number of different ways, can be harmful to international politics, usually in the process of policy making and interacting with other countries. So let's get right into it. The first myth is that Afghanistan is the grave of empires. And this myth can be generally summed up in a couple of different ways. One is that Afghanistan is unconquerable, or that if somebody does conquer Afghanistan, that it automatically means that their country will imminently collapse, or that the people of Afghanistan simply cannot be governed. And all of these are demonstrably false through studying the history of Afghanistan. So, for example, early on, what we can see is Afghanistan had been conquered by various Iranian dynasties throughout history. We can see that they were conquered by the Greeks, by the Kushan, by the Hunas, by the Turks, by the Mongols, and even the British at some point. Now, it is worth noting that, like any country, not every attempt to conquer a region is successful, and there are, of course, other failed conquests. And it is also worth noting that some people might argue, well, they may have been conquered, but the people in the mountains, they've never really been controlled. But to be fair, you could say the same thing about any country. For example, you could say that the city of Detroit isn't really part of the United States because there are no goat zones, and that there are gangs with territory and stuff. So in a way, the same thing can apply to other areas, but people generally wouldn't say that Detroit isn't part of the United States simply because organized crime exists, or because there is organized resistance to the government in a certain area. That doesn't mean that it's not part of a country. It just means that it has a problem with crime. So you could say the same thing about many other regions of the world. So, moving on to that. So, Afghanistan can be conquered and it can be governed, as has been shown for history. There's also a number of different empires centered on Afghanistan that have arisen throughout history as well. And what we know is that the people are governable. There have been periods of prosperity in the history of Afghanistan, and whereas recently the United States had failed to train many Afghan troops to have a good state of readiness. At the same time, a few decades earlier, the Soviets had actually succeeded in training Afghan troops. So in that sense, it is worth noting that a lot of today's myths about Afghanistan have arisen relatively recently. So, what about the Soviets and the Americans? Because they invaded Afghanistan, but they didn't stay there, and they eventually left. Well, in the case of the Soviets, it is worth noting that it wasn't an attempt to integrate Afghanistan into the Soviet Union. They were simply propping up a collapsing communist government in Afghanistan that had run into trouble. And eventually, the Soviets pulled back from there. And while some people would attribute this would attribute the collapse of the Soviet Union partially to the long-term failure in Afghanistan, it is worth noting that the Soviet Union was having other problems, and the collapse of the Soviet bloc really wasn't centered on arguments in relation to Afghanistan or on the major losses of Afghanistan. So I think that that's very important to realize. And in the case of the United States never even mobilized troops in the sense of implementing the draft or making a serious effort, you could say, in taking over Afghanistan, in the sense that the United States had very restrictive rules of engagement throughout a lot of their involvement in Afghanistan. And eventually they actually came to a negotiated peace with the Taliban. And throughout the whole time, they weren't trying to integrate Afghanistan into the United States. They were trying to prop up their own liberal democracy in Afghanistan, which is something I'll get back to. But of course, that eventually failed. But I would say that in both the cases of the Soviet Union or the United States, if they had seriously attempted to take over Afghanistan in the long term, they probably would have succeeded. Now, in the case of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had other problems leading to its collapse, that would have been a very brief rule, so that certainly wouldn't count. But in the case of the United States, unless the United States collapses in the near future, I could say that if the United States had attempted to integrate Afghanistan, I don't think that it would have been particularly difficult, in the sense that other countries have conquered other countries throughout history, so it wouldn't be something unusual because Afghanistan itself has been conquered many times in the past. But anyway, moving along from that, I'll simply conclude that Afghanistan clearly is not unconquerable. It is not the graveyard of empires, as many consider it to be. So the second element here, the second question here, is the question of the stability of the Middle East. And the myth here is that the Middle East is perpetually unstable. And this is untrue also from looking at historical evidence. What we can see is stability in the period where the Ottoman Empire was dominant in the region. And going back from that, there's many different periods of stability. But just like Western Europe, or just like India, or just like Western Africa, these periods of stability are interspersed with sometimes prolonged periods of instability. So the argument that the Middle East is perpetually unstable, in my view, is largely based on looking at its history since World War I, wherein a lot of political centers changed around and new leadership came into power, and people that hadn't governed themselves in a long time were governing themselves, and new borders were drawn, etc. And this led to some instability, and new ideologies emerged. What you see is the rise of new theocratic ideologies, as well as the rise of the Ba'ath party in various countries in the region. So Arab nationalism and Islamism rising, and of course an opposing push from Western countries to implement liberal democracies. And of course you see Kurdish nationalism, etc., and other groups rising up. But a lot of these movements didn't actually exist 200 years ago. So it is very interesting how people see the current chaos and they extrapolate that to many years ago, and they might think about things like the Crusades, ancient wars mentioned in the Bible, and other things. But in those time periods, there were also problems in other regions of the world, and there were also areas of the world that were more stable. So the instability of the Middle East, in my view, is a very anachronistic view of history that takes recent events and extrapolates them over a longer time to which it does not apply, and also that ignores the history of other areas of the world in order to make the argument that the Middle East is uniquely unstable or cannot be stabilized. And while I do agree that in the current situation, there's likely not too many effective solutions to a lot of problems in the Middle East, I will also say that just like in the past there has been stability, there will probably be an opportunity in the future for stability as well. So now for the third myth. The third myth that we're looking at is the supremacy of liberal democracy, the superiority of liberal democracy. And, or to be more exact, the idea that liberal democracy is the only type of government that works. Now, let me be very clear. I do think that there are several advantages of that liberal democracy has, and I do think that liberal democracy can be broadly better than a number of other types of government. Now, that being said, I would not go to the extreme that liberal democracy is the end of history type government that some people propose it is. I would not go to the extreme of Whig historiography that says that liberal democracy is the bastion of progress, that it is the natural path of all countries, that it is something that everyone should strive for, that it is something that is supremely virtuous. I would not say that. And I would say that there are many examples throughout history of non-liberal and non-democratic societies that have had various degrees of success. And whether or not you consider a country to be successful really depends on what your values are, and that means what you're looking for from a country. So the success of a country cannot be easily simply put as a yes or no binary, because there are countries that can be less successful but can still be functional. So a country can be partially functional but still be functional. So I could say the Soviet Union is a dysfunctional country in history, but the Soviet Union nevertheless persevered for several decades, and in that time was one of the primary rivals to the world's most powerful liberal democracy, the United States of America. So, in that sense, we can understand that liberal democracies aren't necessarily the only type of government that is capable of competing. They are not the only type of government that people could consider virtuous, because the effectiveness of a government, you could say that it is on a spectrum, but you could also say that it is on multiple spectrums, depending on the values that you have and depending on different qualities that a government has. So there could be, let's say, a Chinese legalist type government that is very strong against corruption and has a very efficient bureaucracy. So you could have that, or you could have a Confucian type government that has a strong focus on virtues, or you could have a fascist government where everybody is unionized and they have progressive social policies, etc., or other types of government that exist throughout the world and throughout history. And these governments can be effective in various ways. And while it is true in the sense of the liberal peace theory that liberal democracies are less likely to go to war against each other, it is also true that these countries are not particularly unlikely to go to war with non-liberal democracies. So in that sense, it is worth noting that the country nowadays in the world that is the most interventionist in a military sense could be described as being the United States of America, which is a liberal democracy. So in that sense, liberal democracies are not necessarily the only effective type of government, and they are also not necessarily the most virtuous type of government that anyone could possibly imagine. So the idea that there's no other option than liberal democracy is simply not true. One, for the fact that in history there have been many other options, and two, for the fact that political theorists such as myself continue to come up with new ideas. So, in that sense, liberal democracy, while it has its advantages, isn't the end all be all of politics. It is not the solution to every problem in politics, as we're seeing today when some countries that were more liberal in the past and more democratic in the past move towards different directions. Or they might be experiencing a stress from the particular way that their government is set up that leads to a long-term corruption problem that they have to resolve, and some of the solutions some of these governments propose would make them less liberal or less democratic. And now, I'm not going to comment on every type of solution that people propose to this, but I will simply say that liberal democracies are not necessarily the best type of government. So, that being said, why are these things problems? Well, with Afghanistan as a problem is how you treat Afghanistan in foreign policy. If you don't think that Afghanistan can be a stable country, it cannot be a stable state, then you're obviously going to limit the options of interaction with Afghanistan, and you're also going to limit your expectations of Afghanistan. So, from a geopolitical, from a grand strategy, from a perspective of international politics, doing that is a disadvantage and therefore is harmful to the international politics that a country wants to exercise. The second one, the idea of permanent instability in the Middle East, is also harmful because for similar reasons with Afghanistan, because if you don't think that it's ever going to be stable, then it's going to limit the options that you're going to have with interacting with countries in the Middle East. And while I'm not arguing in favor of any particular action in the Middle East or Afghanistan in this video, I just want to say that realistically, you shouldn't limit your options based on an idealistic assumption, based on an assumption that assumes that things are in a certain way that they aren't in reality. So the third one, the idea that liberal democracies are superior, the problem with that is that liberal democracies haven't always been around, and they aren't always going to be favored by everyone. And also, if you go to another country that is not a liberal democracy and you exercise in diplomacy, you can end up insulting that country and reducing your ability to negotiate successfully in a diplomatic context. So it's very important to understand that just because you think that your type of government is better than another type of government, that you don't then treat other countries as if they don't pose a threat or as if they don't have the right to negotiate on the same level as you, because for all you know, they might actually be very successful. They might be implementing very successful reforms. They might actually be in a situation where they can gain an advantage over you. And that is something that you have to be very afraid of. Just like in the United States, although they were very aware of the disadvantages that the Soviet Union might have, and they had very strong criticisms of communism, they also considered the Soviet Union as a serious threat, despite it not being a liberal democracy, because the Soviet Union could nevertheless have the capability to dominate the world, in a sense. That's not to say that the Soviet Union was actively trying to conquer the world. That's not what I'm saying. But it was, in my view, a serious concern, and a concern that could be said to be legitimate on the part of any person that understands that just because a government is less effective in certain ways doesn't mean that it is totally ineffective. So there you go. That's my thoughts on these three myths that are harmful to international politics. Tell me what you think in the comments section below, and thank you all for watching. I've been Anawiltus, over and out.